You know, as a nation, we faced one of the most difficult moments in our history, in my view. 4 historic crises all at the same time. The worst pandemic in 100 years that's already killed nearly 200,000 people and counting. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression that's cost tens of millions of American jobs and counting. Emboldened white supremacy unseen since the 60s and a reckoning on race that's long overdue. And undeniable acceleration of the punishing reality of climate change on our planet and our people, on the lives and livelihoods, which I'd like to talk about now. Jill and I continued, as I suspect all of you do, is pray for everyone in California, Oregon, and Washington, and across the West as these devastating wildfires rage on, just as we hold them in our hearts, those who have faced the hurricanes, tropical storms off our coast of Florida, North Carolina, or like parts of New Orleans that in fact have just been issued an emergency evacuation order for Hurricane Sally. Floods and droughts across the Midwest, the fury of climate change everywhere, all this year and right now. We stand with our families who have lost everything, the firefighters, the first responders, risking everything to save others, and the millions of Americans caught between relocating during a pandemic or staying put as ashes and smoke pollute the air they breathe. Let's think about that. People are not just worried about raging fires. They're worried about the air they breathe, about the damage to their lungs. Parents are already worried about COVID-19 for their children when they're indoors, and now they're worried about asthma attacks if their kids are outside. Over the past 2 years, the total damage from wildfires has reached nearly $50 billion in California alone. $50 billion. This year alone, nearly 5 million acres have burned across 10 states, more acreage than the entire state of Connecticut. And it's only September. California's wildfire season typically runs through October. Fires are blazing so brightly, smoke reaching so far, NASA satellites can see them 1 million miles away in space. The cost of this year's damage will again be astronomically high. But think of it from the view on the ground, in the smoldering ashes. Loved ones lost, along with the photos, the keepsakes, all the memories. Spouses and kids praying each night for their firefighter husband, father, wife, and mother. Will they come home? Entire communities destroyed. We have to act as a nation. It shouldn't be so bad that millions of Americans live in the shadow of an orange sky and they're left asking, is doomsday here? And I know this feeling of dread and anxiety extends well beyond the fires. We've seen record hurricane season, costing billions of dollars as well. Last month, Hurricane Laura intensified at a near record rate just before its landfall along the Louisiana and Gulf Coast. It's a troubling marker, not for just the increased frequency of the hurricanes, but more powerful and destructive storms. They're causing record damage after record damage to people's homes, lives, and livelihoods. And before it intensified and hit the Gulf Coast, Laura ravaged Puerto Rico, where 3 years ago Hurricane Maria, our fellow Americans there are still recovering from its damage and devastation. Think about that reality. Our fellow Americans are still putting things back together from the last big storm as they face the next one. We've also seen historic flooding in the Midwest, often compounding the damage delivered by last year's floods that cost billions of dollars in damage. Many of you traveled through the Midwest on that bus tour and you saw it. this past spring in Midland, Michigan, experienced a flood so devastating, with deadly flash flooding overrunning dams and roadways, that it displaced 10,000 residents. It was considered once in a 500-year weather event. But those once in many generation events, they're now happening every year. The past 10 years were the hottest decade ever recorded. The Arctic is literally melting. Parts are actually on fire. What we're seeing in America, in our communities, is connected to all of this. With every bout with nature's fury caused by our own inaction on climate change, more Americans see and feel the devastation, whether in a big city, small towns, on coastlines, or in farmlands. It's happening everywhere, and it's happening now, and it affects us all. Nearly 200 cities, not Republican or Democratic cities, 200 cities are experiencing the longest stretches of deadly heat waves in 50 years. It requires them to help their poor and elderly residents adapt to the extreme heat to simply stay alive, especially in the homes without air conditioning, which many don't have. Our family farmers in the Midwest are facing historic drought. Those follows record floods and hurricanes, sped by windstorms all this year. The speed of those windstorms has been incredible when you saw it on television or saw it in person. It's ravaged millions of acres of corn, soybeans, and other crops. Their very livelihoods, which sustain their families and our economy for generations, is now in jeopardy. How do they pay their bills this year? What will be left to pass on to their kids? And none of this is happening in a vacuum. A recent study showed air pollution is linked with increased risk of death from COVID-19. Our economy can't recover if it can't build back. With more resiliency, more ability to withstand extreme weather that will only come with greater frequency and intensity. The unrelenting impact of climate change affects every single solitary one of us. But too often, the brunt falls disproportionately on communities of color, exacerbating the need for environmental justice. Sorry, as a bug. Speaking of the environment. These are interlocking crises of our time. It requires action, not denial. It requires leadership, not scapegoating. It requires the president to meet the threshold duty of the office, to care for everyone, to defend us from every attack, seen and unseen, always and without exception. Because here's the deal. Hurricanes don't swerve to avoid red states or blue states. Wildfires don't skip towns that voted a certain way. The impacts of climate change don't pick and choose. That's because it's not a partisan phenomenon. It's science. And our response should be the same, grounded in science.